These world leaders say they may have finally worked out a way to end what's so far been the bloodiest conflict of the 21st century. Syria's war has brought suffering to millions of people and caused repercussions far beyond the country's borders. Since the war began in 2011, nearly 500,000 people have been killed. That's largely due to airstrikes by Russian and Syrian regime jets, as well as suicide car bomb attacks and shelling by Daesh and the Nusra Front. The fighting has included the use of barrel bombs and chemical weapons, banned by the Geneva Convention. And around 7 million people, more than a third of them children, have been made homeless and forced to flee the country. Almost half have been granted refuge in Turkey, while the rest have sought shelter across the world. The war has also destroyed Syrian infrastructure, causing the economy to lose $226 billion, resulting in massive food shortages. But the latest talks between Russia, Turkey and Iran appear to have struck one of the most positive notes yet of any peace talks on the conflict.
Можно с уверенностью констатировать, что мы подошли к новому этапу, открывающему возможность приступить к реальному политическому процессу урегулирования.
The presidents of Iran and Turkey echoed the comments, with the change in Ankara's previously skeptical view of the Russian-sponsored process being particularly striking.
Geldiğimiz nokta önemlidir ama yeterli değildir. Suriye halkının kabul edebileceği kalıcı ve muteber bir siyasi çözümün tesis edilmesi için ilgili tüm çevrelerin katkıyı sağlaması elzemdir.
The breakthrough was made 2 days after Putin met with Syria's Bashar al-Assad, whose forces currently have the upper hand in the war. That's only been achieved by backing from Russia and Iran, and they still appear keen to ensure their man stays in the game.
Today, there will be Putin's phone conversation with the King of Saudi Arabia, and one can certainly expect that Putin will of course inform his Saudi counterpart about yesterday's working visit to Sochi.
Riyadh has been holding a conference of Syrian opposition groups simultaneous to Sochi, which started with the resignation of Riyadh Hijab. He was the head of the opposition HNC, a faction that had ruled out talks with Bashar al-Assad under any circumstances. Hijab did not give any reasons for his resignation. But ahead of the main Geneva talks, it appears to clear the way for the Syrian opposition to become more cooperative, to something that was once unthinkable: the continuing role of Assad as head of the Syrian state. It's all happened with the tacit acknowledgement of the US as Russia moves to the role of the main arbiter of the conflict. It's left the West in the unexpected position of a bystander, and it's unclear how much of a role it will play in determining the future of Syria. Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Bassam Barabandi. He's a former Syrian diplomat and the co-founder of the NGO People Demand Change. From Ankara, we have Temur Akhmetov. He's an analyst at the Russian International Affairs Council. And in Dubai, Monzer Akbek, he's the spokesman for Al-Ghad Party and a former member of the Syrian opposition coalition. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Bassam Barabandi, let me start with you. Talks in Sochi, we've had talks in Astana, talks in Riyadh. Geneva is not just a place anymore, it's an idea. What's the most encouraging thing to come out of all of that recently?
The most encouraging thing that comes, that nothing will happen. I know it's very, very well known that the Russian is investing heavily on the process of Sochi after Astana. And with the deal with the Americans, they make it clear that Geneva is the baseline for doing the negotiation. President Putin was clear in his statement saying that Sochi will become first, and at the end stages of Sochi will be Geneva or the UN involvement in Syrian crisis. The problem of Sochi, it has no clue what the Russians are hoping to do. They hope, or they claim, or that they can get all the Syrians together and accepting Bashar to be run for the elections and stay in the power without any real concessions. I see this difficult to achieve. The deal between Turkey, Russia, Iran doesn't build on the trust. It's built more on small tactical steps among these three countries to solve the Syrian, to achieve their own interest. We don't know when this interest will diverge, when this interest will get together, overlap. Today, yesterday, it looks they are working together, but when we look about PYD, SDF, or the PKK involvement in Sochi, it will become a problem. When we talk about the South Syria, where Hezbollah is existing,
certainly, Bassam, we've got two other guests.
Bigger problem that
certainly, we've got two other guests. I want to bring them in, and I'm sorry for interrupting you. Temir, are you as negative and skeptical as Bassam is about these talks, or do you believe that something truly good can come out of this?
First of all, I should urge you from not having too high expectations from the Sochi meeting. As we know, Russia repeatedly underlined that the Geneva process enjoys supremacy. And I think that we should view the Sochi mechanism and Astana talks as a preparation for the Geneva negotiations. And nowadays we should see actually Sochi talks as the trust-building measures, and there are still a lot of problems that should be solved by all sides. And Russia is doing exactly this by convening with Iran and Turkey that support different sides to the conflict.
Yeah, everybody wants a deal for different reasons. Monzir, let me put it to you this way. Many people like Bassam don't like the idea of any deal going ahead because they feel it means that Assad's future is off the table. Assad will stay in power, and the main player calling the shots, if it comes to a final resolution, is Assad's biggest backer, which is Vladimir Putin. That's why it leaves a bitter taste in their mouth and they refuse to accept it. Can you understand why they refuse to accept it? Because more than 350,000 people have been killed, and the people who are mostly responsible for the vast majority of those deaths are calling the shots when it comes to peace.
Well, this is speculative. Now, when you say that this process is not going to lead to anything and this process is going to lead to keep Bashar Assad in power, we cannot just determine that for sure. Now we know, everybody knows that the solution in Syria is not a military one, it's a political. We have realized that since we were in the coalition and participated in Geneva early 2014, also when we did the Cairo conference 2015, and we realized also that the Russians are on the driver's seat in terms of the solution in Syria. So that's why we got engaged with them on early stage, got a lot of negotiations and talks with them, and actually they have told us about the idea of Sochi much earlier than when it was announced to the public.
Certainly.
And we found out that the idea itself, by getting all the groups of Syrians to agree on a new constitution that will allow them to end the civil war and move into peace and move into a political transition that is starting with a new constitution.
And I understand
this idea is somehow a valid idea that we were convinced with, and they are going to participate in it.
We've got two other people here. I want to come back to you in just a second, but I want to use as an example what Sergei Lavrov had to say about the resignation of Mr. Riyad Hijab, the head of the HNC. This is what Sergei Lavrov said. He said, the retreat of radically minded opposition figures from playing the main role will make it possible to unite this motley opposition, internal and external, on a more reasonable, realistic and constructive platform. We will support the efforts made by Saudi Arabia in this respect. So you have the head of the HNC, Riyad Hijab, essentially, Monzir, being smeared here by Mr. Lavrov. He sees him as radical, he sees him as extreme. So again, I ask you, if Mr. Lavrov is allowed to frame it in this way, that only the opposition that they deem valid are valid and everybody else is extreme, how can you have a proper solution going forward, Monzir?
Well, I don't agree for a foreign power to classify the opposition. This guy is good and this guy is bad. Of course, all Syrian oppositions, they are fighting for a just cause, which is the democratic transition in Syria, and Riyad Hijab is one of them. Now, on the other hand, also we have disagreed with the HNC when they have, for example, withdrawn from Geneva process back in 2016, last year, and we lost a year. And in this year, we have lost Aleppo, we have lost a lot of ground on the, and there was a huge violence, increasing violence at that time. We also disagree on what when they put a precondition to the negotiations, because the negotiations should take place with the regime itself. And the transition, the political transition, is a negotiated one with the regime. So when they say that the regime has to step down now, then who they are going to negotiate with? Now, all of us want Assad out of power.
So,
Assad,
Monzir, let's take that and
see Assad as a criminal dictator.
Good point. That's a good point.
We have to agree on the process, how we are going to get him out of power.
Let's take that and pose it to Bassam. Bassam, who are you going to talk to if Assad must step down first? Isn't that a good point? The whole point of negotiations is to talk with those you hate the most, right?
True. No, let's put things in real context. I agree with Mr. Monzir about the big picture, but I have big problem with the details that he mentioned. Number one, the UN Security Council 2254, it's explicitly said the steps that should go into negotiation. Russian, if they have the goodwill, they are the leading drive for the negotiation, that's true. If they are really serious in solving the way the Syrian people likes, the way they do Sochi, why don't they just empower Geneva process itself? As for the regime, the HNC or Riyad Hijab, as far as I know, he said we don't have precondition. The precondition is what the UN Security Council resolution, and we should not negotiate them. We should discuss and negotiate how to implement them. So there is a process. There is lines, clear lines. Where should we go forward? What should we negotiate with? And I don't think they said the regime should step down right now before the process, because otherwise the question would be valid if the regimes step aside with whom we will negotiate. The issue was the regime should not be part of the end solution. And the regime, Assad and his group, it's not about the institution of the government. So that's what make more doubts about what Russia is playing, what Russia wants, how to negotiate with the regime, that he killed all the people, and is that Russia wants the Syrian people to accept the regime as de facto, as counterpart. We come back to Security Council Resolution 2254. It has steps, very clear steps. The elections and the people who will be elected in the transitional period, they will do the constitution, rather than what Russia wants to start by the constitution, and then we go to the elections.
Understood.
So that's the bigger questions.
Yes,
so
and you made it quite clear.
So we know Russia has big play.
Yes.
Big role to play.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, but you don't want them to drive that process forward. Timur, looking at it geopolitically, is it clear right now, in late November 2017, that the US has a very small role to play, and that the real shapers of this conflict ending, if it does end, or whatever solution we have, are Mr. Putin, President Rouhani, President Erdogan? Those are the presidents who are shaping the end of this conflict, and not the Americans. Is that clear?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that it can be seen that the Astana and Sochi meetings are somehow drive the U.S. out from the solving process. But to my mind, ultimately, Russia wants Americans to be a part of this process because they enjoy international control over the UN. And that's why ultimately Russia will try to engage U.S. as well. But for now, U.S. stays somehow aside from the process. But in the backdoor meetings, connections and ties, Russian officials are actively communicating with Americans. And it doesn't mean that Washington is somehow sidelined by Russia. For now, it seems that Russia is trying to engage, first of all, regional actors that primarily exert influence on the ground in Syria.
Okay, so Munzir, whether Washington is actively sidelined or not, or whether it's by design, Washington has a diminished role as we move forward. I mean, symbolically, visually, we're seeing other presidents at the forefront. They're hosting the peace conferences. They're trying to find active ways to extricate themselves out of it and find a solution. Is a diminished role from Washington, Munzir, helping or harming the situation?
Well, I don't believe that the Washington role is completely diminished. What I believe in is that the Russians has agreed with the Americans on a general paths or addresses, like, for example, fighting terrorism, a political solution as per Geneva Communiqué and Security Council Resolution 2254, ceasefire between the regime and moderate opposition. These are general things that they have agreed on. But for the details, I believe that the Americans, they have left for the Russians to set up all the details of those general ideas. Now, as we say that, we have realized that from early stage, and even when I was in the National Coalition, the American ambassador at that time, Mr. Robert Ford, he was always insisting that we should go and talk with the Russians. Right. Even in back in 2013. And we engaged with them. Last meeting we had with Mr. Lavrov was last month. And they are saying that they are committed to Geneva Communiqué as they have signed on it. They have committed to the Security Council resolution with the political transition, genuine political transition that leads to new constitution and free elections that is supervised by the United Nations, that all Syrians will participate inside Syria and outside Syria. Right. We have to put these statements into a testing. This means that they have their military, they have their veto in the Security Council, they have their army in Syria, that they have changed the whole military situation in Syria. And they are saying that they are with the Geneva Communiqué and political transition. We have to put this into test, and we have to engage with the Russian process as it is in order to see where it's going to lead. This doesn't mean that we are going to go to Sochi or to Moscow and we're going to accept to let go our struggle for freedom and democracy. Okay. Not at all. Good point. Good point. We are going to take our fight for freedom and democracy and we are going to put it there on the table and we are going to put onto test what the Russians have signed off and what they have promised. Okay.
Let me ask you, Bassam, very finally. Out of Astana came the de-escalation zones. All things considered, they have been a relative success. Things are quieter. Things are not perfect. Things are quieter. It was a terrible situation and it's a bit quieter. Why don't you trust those who came up with the ideas of the de-escalation zones to take it further and maybe eventually achieve ultimate peace in your country?
Yeah, actually this de-escalating zone as an idea I think is good in short term. The three countries who agree on it, they agree on it on specific zone in Syria and for short time. They said clearly it's for 6 months and it's renewed. If the three countries are really serious in achieving the stability and stopping the killing in Syria, they consider Syria altogether the escalating zone, except the ISIS and the Jabhat al-Nusra area, the terrorist groups. Otherwise, why to make some areas de-escalated and some area escalated? We saw the deal, let's say, the escalating zone in Ghouta, and we say how much the Russian and the regime are attacking Ghouta for the last 2 days. So what happens, the big picture is nice to say de-escalating, the people are getting more aid, they're getting more stability or security, but in reality, the Russian and the regime and the Iranian, they are playing games where to move the powers, manpowers, to the area they needed. And the other areas, they say, okay, now we consider this de-escalated. So today, Ghouta is under attack, huge attack violating all the de-escalating zone that have agreed on it. I believe the next step will be Daraa in the south. For any reason, the regime and the Iranian will go to the border with Israel and Jordan. So the de-escalating zone, it's good short term for the people to feel that they are have some kind of security. In long term, it's not serious thing. Otherwise, why don't make all Syria de-escalating zone except the areas where they are fighting terrorists?
Okay, gentlemen, I've got to move on, but it's been great to talk to all of you.
Just to answer my friend,
I'm sorry, Bassam, I've got to jump in because I've got to move on. My sincere apologies, I've got to move on. But we'll have you again on the program. Okay. We'll be watching this story very closely and all the talks that are taking place in multiple cities. Bassam Barabandi, Timur Akhmetov, and Monzer Akbek, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.